Mark, thank you very much for your keynote speech and your policy observations today. Next up is the debate session, where certain policy aspects of the international tax system will be debated. This section is somewhat audience interactive in that some of you have handheld polling devices, which will enable you to register your views on various propositions as we go through this segment. The debate is going to be moderated by Willard Taylor, and the debate team includes Mark Mazur, Professor David Rosenblum of NYU Law School, Professor Daniel Shaviro of NYU Law School, and Kimberly Blanchard of Weil Gotshal and Manges. Professor Rosenblum is the James S. Eustice Visiting Professor of Taxation, and he's the Director of the International Tax Program at NYU Law School. David is a member of Kaplan and Drysdale and served as International Tax Counsel and Director at the Office of International Tax Affairs in the U.S. Treasury Department. A frequent speaker and author on tax subjects, David has taught international tax at Stanford, Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard Law Schools, and other educational institutions around the globe. Professor Daniel Shaviro is the Wayne Perry Professor of Taxation at NYU Law School and formerly served with the Joint Congressional Committee on Taxation. Professor Shaviro teaches tax policy-related topics at NYU and is a prolific author on topics involving tax policy, budget policy, and entitlements issues. Most recently, Professor Shaviro authored a book entitled Fixing U.S. International Taxation, a very fitting title for today's program. Kim Blanchard is a partner with Weil Gotshal and Manges. Kim is a former chair of the tax section of the New York State Bar Association and has lectured and published extensively on numerous aspects of international taxation. Kim is active at the ABA's International Tax Committee and serves on the editorial board of the Tax Management International Journal. Kim is the vice president of the International Tax Institute and earned her J degree from NYU Law School. With that, during this next segment, we have selected 4 propositions to debate, and all within 60 minutes. Willard and debate team, please assume your positions.
All right.
We're sitting, we don't know where we're sitting.
Any place.
Yeah, I stand. Okay, so we should start this. As Larry said, we have 4 debate questions, and after each one of them, you will all pull out your little thing. If you don't have one of these gizmos, you can get it at the door, which will give you an opportunity to vote. With 4 debaters and 4 propositions, we have about 3 minutes each on each subject for the speakers, and the rest of the time will be spent voting. So the first question is debate. Is corporate residence meaningful as a basis for jurisdiction to tax? And if not, and assuming we keep the corporate income tax, what are the alternatives? And I know this is something you have good, strong feelings about, David, so why don't you begin?
All right. I would respond resoundingly in the affirmative to this question. I think corporate residence is meaningful as a basis for jurisdiction to tax. I think the question needs a little refinement because I think pretty much anyone would say that we need rules to differentiate between the taxation of foreign persons on a gross basis and a net basis, and in some sense that's a residence test. We also, I think, need corporate residence to determine the source of income. For example, we currently source dividends and interest in accordance with the residence of the payor. So I think for those purposes, we clearly need corporate residence. But the question isn't really going to that. The question is going to whether we should have a tax based on a corporation based on its residence. And that is really, I think, an alternative way of articulating a territorial question. And in my judgment, corporate residence is still very meaningful as a basis to tax on that basis as well. Now, I'm not necessarily saying our current test of corporate residence is the best one, but corporate residence as an abstract matter, I think, is here to stay.
Dan?
Well, I'm going to say, I guess, yes, although no. Is corporate residence inherently a very meaningful thing? I would say no, in the sense that where people live is meaningful, but a corporation is an intangible entity. So in some abstract sense, it's not a very meaningful thing. But should the U.S., under the current circumstances, continue to use it? I would say the answer is yes, because it is useful, even though it's not incredibly meaningful. And I think this is why, if you look at territorial countries around the world, so-called territorial countries that supposedly don't tax foreign source income, they actually do have CFC rules, and that means that they are taxing foreign source income to some extent, and they are relying on corporate residence to some extent. Of course, they don't tax the foreign source income, at least explicitly or directly, of other countries' resident companies by their own measures. So one reason that it is desirable to use residence as well as source is when you've got a whole lot of bad tools in your toolkit, you at least might as well take out more than one of them. So source is a really bad tool. So even assuming that we only wanted to tax US source income, when we have such a bad tool that doesn't work well, kind of dragging out another bad tool also, namely the residence rules, makes things slightly less bad. And the reason for that is that at least for US companies, it's kind of hard to tax. Taxing their foreign source income is sometimes a proxy for income that we think was shifted from the domestic tax base. And this is very much how other countries use it too. So I think it's kind of would be foolish to give it away right now. I'll talk later about in some of the other questions how we've maybe overused residence or used it the wrong way and made less than optimal use of it for kind of handling the income shifting problem.
Kim, do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with David either. I think it's very difficult to separate the question of whether you think corporate residence is meaningful from the two separate questions of how you determine corporate residence, which David said, you know, we don't have time for that right now, and then how you use it. And let me start out with the end of that. I mean, in our system, once we determine that a corporation is a US corporation, we tax it on its worldwide income, subject to deferral and all that other stuff we've been talking about today. Whereas if you're not a US corporation, we only tax you on your FDAP and your ECI. So it's a very meaningful distinction. I'm not sure why it's a meaningful distinction, but that's what we have. In other countries, the significance of residence is different. If you're a resident in a more territorial country, you know, you're subject to tax on your income of that country, but not necessarily on worldwide. So they're just using it in a different way. And in terms of how we determine corporate residence, I mean, to me, that's the real question. Just to take an extreme example, although not as outre as it might first appear, imagine that you have a client who's a foreign investor who invests in a bucket of US and other worldwide non-US securities through the simple medium of a tax transparent partnership, who happens to be a domestic partnership because why not? Doesn't matter. But imagine now that all of a sudden, because of a mistake somebody made or because of a rule that's in the regulations, that partnership is not a partnership. Imagine it's a corporation. And it becomes a US corporation because it was set up under US law. Well, now this foreign person is owns 100% or close to that of a domestic corporation taxable on its worldwide income, and none of the facts have changed. So before, when there was no tax at all in the US, now it's all subject to tax. And to me, that just is not a system that makes sense.
Mark, you have a view on this question? Or?
Yeah, so just want to make a couple observations. One, really the complaints about residence-based taxation typically relate to the fact that in the age of multinationals being able to choose where they incorporate, where they manage their operations from, it almost is a matter of choice of residence from the standpoint of those things. However, agreeing with Dan, even though it may not be a great tool, it's one that we have and the one that we're using here. And I think to build on Kim's point, if you think about extreme examples, if you think about having a destination-based tax on services, that looks a lot like a VAT. And so it doesn't even look like a corporate income tax anymore, or income tax anymore. It looks like a value-added tax. And so really, if you kind of focus on extreme examples, you kind of find yourself moving between different types of taxation without like a good anchor point. So getting back to Dan's point, may not be a great rule, one that we've got, one that we're sort of used to, one that has some applications.
Okay. So we have the first polling question. And on your little device, if you vote A, yes, corporate residence is meaningful as a basis for jurisdiction to tax, you push 1. And if you say no, corporate residence is no longer useful, Kim's point of view, and there are lots of alternatives, such as source of income, you press 2. So go at it. And? Now, do we announce this result?
Florida's not in yet, I think.
We have a
counting it one by
technical
one.
issue. Maybe we should just count hands.
And what's the? Okay, sorry guys, we're going to repoll. So you get another chance to express your views. 1 is A. Could we switch back to the questions? Could you switch back to the questions so people can be repolled? Now, next one, the next one. Forward. It's like Bloomberg going down. The markets are in suspense.
Usually this goes off without a hitch. There we go.
Okay, so yes is 1A. No, corporate residence is no longer useful, is 2B. If everybody could vote again.
But no more music. Oh, I guess.
No, you get your music.
I don't think Alex Trebek ever had this problem.
Right.
Okay,
This is it. Do or
this
die.
is it.
No.
Doesn't work.
Okay, so tell you what, we're going to go, can you work on this, and we'll go ahead and do the
We'll go
other
on to the next
questions, and
question.
Do a
then we'll
vote of
vote
hands.
at the
Do
end.
the hands.
Okay.
Maybe do the hands.
So,
well, why not have a show of hands?
Third vote.
because we can't, Dan, we can't, I'm
You can do
not
a show of
capable of counting the hands.
Yeah, but they
Okay,
can.
so the second debate question, if you could put that up. Have we got it up? Okay. The second debate question is the U.S. tax system really broken? Is reforming the U.S. corporate tax a top-tier item for policymakers, or can we just muddle along? So, Mark, this is your specialty. What do you think?
Well, I think I just spent about 30 minutes talking about the U.S. tax system, and really that needs to be fixed and should be a top-tier issue for policymakers. I think the president recognized that in his framework for business tax reform. I think that it's been a top-tier issue for the administration for some time. As I pointed out, under current rules, there's just too much in a way of disparities between how industries are taxed, how assets are taxed, how different forms of financing are taxed. And so the basic problem we have here is that we have a series of provisions in the corporate tax that really aren't doing what they're intended to do. So I think it really would be a top-tier issue for policymakers.
But not really broken.
Not really broken.
Right. Okay. Dan, do you have a view? Or?
Well, there's no question that the corporate tax system is pretty bad. But if it's like suddenly broke and there's like a big crisis, I'd like to see what the evidence of that is. It seems like it's just kind of bad as it's been bad for a long time. Maybe it's marginally trending worse, but I don't see that it's getting dramatically worse. I personally, apart from the fact that it's my field, so it's always fun for me if people are working and doing stuff in this area. Leaving that aside, I would kind of tend to tell policymakers there are a lot of higher priorities. Think about the infrastructure and the highway system and education and rising inequality and things like that. I'd sort of like prioritize a lot of those things ahead. And one thing I'm not that persuaded about is the virtue of doing standalone corporate tax reform, where you kind of reform the corporate tax system, you lower the rate and you broaden the base, you kind of keep everything else in the income tax the same the way it was before. If you don't do that carefully, you can cause all kinds of messy problems, like you kind of disrupt, not that it's wonderful now, but you disrupt the relationship between the corporate and non-corporate business sector. So for example, if the latter gets sort of base broadening without the rate cut. You also create problems with the relationship between the corporate tax and the individual tax. I very much think of the corporate tax as a backup for the individual tax. A lot of it is for the problem of owner-employees who underpay themselves because it's their money either way. And if you have the individual rate is a lot higher than the corporate rate, you got some issues there that you're not really having owner-employees who might be very successful people in some cases paying the rate they're kind of supposed to pay. Then they hold the stock till death, and then they get the step-up in basis. So I think that's a pretty big problem. I think there's this kind of fascination in the, because the '86 tax reform was kind of a powerful experience, and I get that. I went through it myself. I was a staffer, and I thought it was great and so forth. I also had a good time with it and all that. But there's this kind of thing, oh, we've got to do it again. Not to quote Karl Marx, because I don't normally do that, but he has this famous quote about everything happens twice. Once it's tragedy and once it's farce. And I think the political situation has changed a lot since then between the parties. The fact that it would now just be the corporate system as a standalone, I worry that we're kind of getting into farce, into doing ill-thought things that don't really fit into the whole fabric if we kind of do standalone corporate tax reform now and put it above other priorities.
Kim, do you
I'm really glad that Dan mentioned the '86 Reform Act, because that was kind of the centerpiece of my reaction to this question. But let me step back for a minute. I do think that the U.S. tax system is irretrievably and fundamentally broken, and I think it has been that way for some time. It didn't suddenly happen. It accreted over many, many, many years. When I began practicing in 1981, after graduating from this fine institution, we got the Economic Recovery Tax Act, ERTA we all called it, and then next year after that we got TEFRA, and then 2 years later we got DEFRA, and then we got tax reform. And then after tax reform in '86, every year after that, with one or two exceptions, we got more on top of all of that. And what was shocking to me when I started practicing, but is no longer shocking because I've seen it so many times I'm deadened to it, is that every time Congress tried to fix something they had done the last time, they didn't do it over, they just added another rule. So now Bernie Sanders is proposing legislation that would add subsection 163N to the code, okay? We're to N, because we just keep adding more on more, and every time you add something, it doesn't work with everything else that's already there. The Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury have no time to try to catch up and fix it, and so we go for years without the answers to the most basic questions, like 959 and 961, which are hideously complex to begin with, but nobody can figure out what to say about them. So it's an enormous, I think I think the one thing that present company excluded, OECD members, tax professors, and government policymakers all underestimate is complexity. I think whenever you talk about complexity, you should assume you know what it means and triple it, because that's the real world.
David?
Well, I like a lot of what was said by each of the other three panelists here, but I would begin by asking the more fundamental question of what exactly we're talking about here.
We didn't want to get into that.
The question talks about the U.S. tax system. Now, I don't particularly think that anything about the individual tax system is broken. I understand the complexity, but it affects a relatively small number of people. The Internal Revenue Service processes 155 million individual tax returns every year, fundamentally without mistakes, fundamentally without corruption. I don't think people realize what an astonishing achievement that is by comparison with the rest of the world. However, I don't think we're talking about the individual system. I think we're talking about the corporate system. If we talk about the corporate system, I think word broken is way too extreme. I'm sort of with Dan. Compared to what? I mean, there are things that cry out for attention a lot more than the corporate tax system. The educational system, the system for infrastructure in the United States, campaign financing, foreign policy with respect to any 12 nations that any of us could reel off. I mean, you know, yeah, can we do things that are good for the corporate tax system? Sure we can. But is it a top-tier issue for policymakers? Only for tax policymakers, in my view.
Well, I've got the thumbs up that our voting system is working, so...
Is our voting system really broken?
We can muddle along. But we'll try a polling question on policy question number 2. If we could, we'll come back to 1. Okay, so number 2, A, which is 1A, yes, it's completely broken. B, which is 2B, no, the system is in need of repair, but hardly a crisis. So.
You got all the answers to you. We didn't have them the first time around.
You tell something.
So 31% think it's completely broken, and 69% it's in need of repair but hardly a crisis, which means that you disproportionately influence the audience, Kim, because you got 31 out of 100, right?
You're in time of the 25,
okay,
right.
so very good. Okay, so why don't we move? We'll do the number 1 now. Should we go back to number 1, if we could? Would you rather we put that at the end? Yes. Okay, so we're going to go to the third debate question then. And the third debate question is, at a minimum, is the U.S. international tax system, or at least the foreign tax credit part of the system, broken? And Kim, maybe you want to lead off?
Sure. You can imagine what my ultimate answer to this question is. First of all, though, I got to say, we don't have a U.S. international tax system. We have a bunch of rules that are not very well coordinated or coherent, and that's what we have. And so people complain that tax practitioners take advantage of all these rules that don't coordinate. Of course we do. It's what we do. And you know, there's never any attempt to fix it. I want to just, though, get down to cases and give one example of a really big thing that's broken, and that is our interest allocation rules. For those of you who have a code in front of you, this is 864E and F, if F ever becomes effective. I think currently it's projected to become effective in the year 2020. So this is a rule that was purposefully written to be unfair. There's no question about this, okay? In fact, in 1986, in that famous time, the Senate's version of our interest allocation rules actually was to be fair. And they said, we're going to allocate interest on a worldwide look-through basis based on, you know, it didn't really matter at that time. If you look through, it doesn't matter whether you base it on assets or gross income. But they were going to look through, and therefore, you would always get the same answer about how you allocate interest, regardless of how you held through corporate boxes, right? And that, of course, is the right answer. And there's nobody who disagrees with that. But at the last minute, they pulled back from the brink, pulled back from the precipice, and instead passed the rule that we have today, which is no, in allocating interest expense, we are going to purposefully over-allocate to foreign source income by counting the stock of a foreign corporation as a separate foreign asset. And therefore, to the extent that that foreign corporation borrows, it doesn't get taken into account appropriately in the formula. That was done on purpose, right? And this is the system that we live in. And this is all about the foreign tax credit, as you know. Interest allocation doesn't matter for any purpose other than figuring out how much foreign source income you have so that you can take your credit, which in and of itself is a violation of capital export neutrality. You shouldn't be limited at all in a purely export neutral world. But here we are, and this is the rule that we have.
David?
Well, once again, I think broken is language that's too extreme for the situation. The international tax system is very complicated, but the complications affect a relatively limited number of people. And I think, at least in my experience, most people have come to live with the rules. Congress tinkers around the edge of the rules. I mean, I would feel differently if we had a functioning legislature in this country, but we don't. So I mean, we're doing the best we can with a system that by and large works. There's a lot of other things in life that don't work perfectly, and chalk this up as yet another one. So I don't think it's broken, no.
Okay. Mark?
I think I agree with Dan that I don't think the system is broken. I do think there are parts that need some repair, however. As I spoke about it a little bit before, there are a number of indications that there are problems with the U.S. International tax system. And I disagree with Kim. I think it really is more of a system and less of an incoherent set of rules, though there are some areas where you might think the coherence could be improved. We have a system where some U.S. multinationals are able to achieve very low effective tax rates with their system, with their operations, and that exacerbates some of the problems that reflect differences across industries, and that's just not good tax policy. Also, there are incentives for U.S. companies to take aggressive positions to strip earnings out of the U.S. and reduce the U.S. tax base. And then this has all led to what we hear called lockout effect, because companies are reluctant to repatriate their tax earnings. All these things can be fixed and can be addressed. And I think the administration's budget proposal is a pretty decent step in that regard. So I think I'd sum up by saying that the system's complicated. It reflects the complex economic activities of multinational firms, but probably not broken.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it won't be a shock if I say also bad but not broken. But I do want to mention there are a couple of crisis items, again, the risk of overstating it. One is clearly the whole stateless income problem is a big problem for us and for other countries. It's something that's hopefully going to be addressed to some degree. Things have probably gotten out of hand a bit. My sense about a lot of countries around the world is that they were willing to let the multinationals plan. They kind of liked it up to a point, and the idea these guys are highly mobile. If we kind of let them play games up to a point, that's kind of good for them coming into our jurisdiction. But the multinationals just got too good at it. Of course, the U.S., through Check the Box, helped contribute to that. So that's why people want to push back a little bit. The other thing I think that's sort of becoming kind of a crisis item, and it's really self-inflicted harm, is just the sheer buildup through deferral and then the accounting rules, permanently reinvested earnings. You have companies with just gigantic amounts abroad. And the problem is not that the companies are being suicidally handicapped, but that it creates, it's related to the inversion situation. Was at a debate a few weeks ago somewhere else in town where people were saying that, I know there was an earlier panel today, I'm sorry, due to my teaching schedule today I couldn't come to it, about voting with their feet and so forth. The way I kind of think about companies inverting by reason of all their cash cow buildups abroad is, suppose you're in town, you owe a lot of money to the bank, and then it turns out that if you leave town, you can kind of like, it's easier to avoid repaying the loan. That wouldn't prove that the town you lived in had a terrible tax overhang. It would just mean that, gee, it's pretty stupid to have something that you can get out of by leaving town. In the case of the current wave inversions, what's kind of going on is the companies just find it easier to access the funds once they have a non-US parent at top, even if technically the subs remain under the US parent. So I think there are a couple of things that we need to address, but it's not really a crisis. It doesn't necessarily require fundamental changes. I do think we should be thinking more about things such as thin cap rules, the type of worldwide rules that the UK and Germany have. And one important thing against sloppy or careless international tax reform is we have all these bad parts that are really bad individually, but interrelated. They're not exactly good when you put them together, but at least they cure some of each other's, they reduce some of each other's worst problems. So I think of deferral as a horrible rule, which is not to judge what tax rate, if any, you want to apply to foreign sourcing, but just that deferral is a terrible way to do things. And I think of foreign tax credits as a bad rule because they kind of make US companies not care how much foreign tax they pay. But each of these bad rules makes the other one less bad. Companies do try to avoid foreign taxes because they know they never bring the money home kind of until the next holiday.
Sounds like you're on the verge of endorsing Kim's position.
Well, we don't want to let that happen. That cannot be. It must be misunderstanding of something. Anyway, but foreign tax credits make deferral less bad because if you don't have credits, you can kind of bring the money home after all. So these two really bad rules, but there's sort of a equipoise, not quite equipoise, they make each other less bad, and you just kind of be mindful of that. I was glad to see the administration, when it was going to have a proposal to kind of get rid of deferral and have a to the extent of having minimum tax, realized that meant the foreign tax problem has to be addressed. You can't just let companies get an automatic immediate dollar for dollar every time they bring a dollar, every time they pay a dollar foreign tax. That would make the foreign tax credit kind of intolerable.
We probably should have had a sub-question, which is, please list the things that are good about the system. But anyway, we didn't. So,
It'd be a very short list.
So yeah, I think it'd be a very short list, at least from these.
They're all in the same part of the code.
So we move to polling question number 3. And the answers are, well, the question is, at a minimum, is the U.S. international tax system, or at least the foreign tax credit part of the system, broken? And A1, yes, the international tax system, including the foreign tax credit part, is broken. And 2B, no,
3B.
While the U.S. international tax system is bad, it can muddle along for a while with just modest changes.
Is it 3B?
Okay?
You actually think it's good.
That's right.
We're going to apologize to all the people who think it's good and have nothing to vote on.
It's clear that it's a 50-50. It's clear that Kim is the most persuasive person here, although I could also say that
just
some
right.
of you guys found anything you liked about the system, apart from the fact it wasn't broken. It's not clear.
I like it, but it's broken.
Okay, so we will move to the fourth debate and final debate question. We have to come back and count number 1. The fourth debate question. What about and this is a subject, of course, that was very much involved in the inversion panel. What about the taxation of inbound or inward investment? Can the rules for outbound investment be reformed without addressing the rules for inbound investment? And Dan, what do you think about that?
Well, I would say that you can, but why would you? You can't. The important thing to keep in mind, well, a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first is that a lot of our taxation of foreign source income is about protecting the domestic tax base, though of course it only affects it when U.S. companies are doing the profit shifting. It doesn't affect it when other companies are doing the profit shifting. And I think the data show that other non-U.S. multinationals have surprisingly low profitability in the U.S. measured by after their own income shifting efforts have gone on. It's clear they can use things like debt, for example, more easily than U.S. companies can. So I think it would be undesirable to address the outbound, such as thinking about territoriality and deferral, without addressing the inbound. But I don't actually like these two words. They're very formalistic words when you have, when we're judging things based on corporate residence. So if I personally create a Cayman's corporation that establishes a pizza parlor in Greenwich Village, that's going to be called inbound investment because it's a Cayman's company. Obviously, it's not really. Actually, the last people I said that to said that I'd go to jail if I tried that. They were kind of, but anyway, so I think that we really have to be concerned about the domestic tax base and about profit shifting out of the U.S., addressing the, so I would use domestic source and foreign source, not really inbound and outbound. We potentially make the problems in the so-called inbound or domestic source even worse if we address the outbound without addressing that. But actually, we should address the inbound stuff in any event, in part because of profit shifting that foreign companies that don't have to worry about our CFC rules can do. And I think, again, things like the way that other countries use thin cap rules, worldwide debt caps, things like that, I think that's among the tools to think about. There are some more ambitious things you could think about also, but probably beyond the scope of this question.
David?
Yeah, I have both a simple, short answer and a much more complicated, longer answer. The simple, short answer is, sure, we could make improvements in the outbound rules, the rules for taxation of foreign income to U.S. persons without addressing the inbound rules. We've done it repeatedly. I don't see why we couldn't do it again. And we could probably, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, we could improve things for outbound without touching at all the inbound rules, the rules for taxing U.S. source income. That's the short, simple answer. The more complicated answer, and I find this, frankly, to be the most interesting of the four questions. If you have been listening to these questions, you'll notice, and indeed the entire day, when people talk about international taxation, they tend to be talking about taxation of U.S. multinational companies. That tends to drive the train on everything. And indeed, even when we talk about inversions and protecting the tax base, it's for inverted companies investing back in the United States, and I think at least, I'm not sure where the current administration proposals are on this, but at one point, administration was basically only interested in protecting the base on inverted companies, which made 0 sense to me. We are a big inbound country. We have been for decades, and I realize that many people don't like to get their arms around that. We have not changed the taxation of inbound, that is to say U.S. source investments earned by foreigners, since 1966. The framework for what we've got there has been there for nearly 50 years. And it's about time we rethought that. And in any kind of a tax reform that deserves the name, and I've been practicing for a long time, I have yet to see one that does deserve the name, but in one that did deserve the name, we would have to include inbound investment. You'd have to deal with it because this is an integral system. And what happens, and moreover, the BEPS project is going to drive us in that direction. Because a lot has been said here on this platform today about BEPS, but one thing I know about BEPS is the resurgence of source basis taxation, however else you want to characterize it. And we, as the United States, are going to be drawn kicking and screaming into that because we are firmly in the bed of residence taxation. That's the way we think of things. That's the way we've thought of things since World War II. That's the way Congress looks at the world. But it's not the way the world works anymore, and BEPS is definitely going to be a resurgence of source basis taxation with all sorts of implications for U.S. investors abroad. And if we cling to our residence favoritism in our rules and our attention span and allow the rest of the world to start focusing on taxing what happens within their markets, trust me, other countries are truly going to eat our lunch. So I think anything serious that we do has to involve inbound investment. Will we get serious? I probably won't be around to see that.
Mark, you have a...
Sure. First, I, for one, hope that David is around to see a serious tax reform. And I think a serious tax reform would do both inbound investment and outbound investment. One little fact that I like to cite, and I stole this from Secretary Geithner, is that the U.S. is responsible for less than 5% of the world's population, responsible for about 20% of the world's GDP, not responsible for about 20% of the world's economic growth. A much smaller fraction of growth is going to be occurring in the U.S. than elsewhere. So international tax rules are important, and it's important to get them right in both directions. I think that we have focused on outbound investment largely because we have a larger economic presence and we've been a capital export country for a while. However, we have seen a lot of activity in inbound investment, and it's one that you want to get right. You don't want to have a situation where you can hollow out the U.S. tax base with rules that apply to inbound investment, and you're left then with just a shell of a corporate tax system that is taxing U.S. domiciled corporations, and that's it. And so you don't want to be in that situation. You need to address inbound investment to do that.
Kim?
Yeah, so it doesn't sound to me like we have a real debate on this question, but let me try.
Since you know you'll win.
Yeah, you do so well.
Let me do two things. First of all, I think one thing that we miss when we make this admittedly arbitrary distinction between inbound and outbound is the opportunity for crafting legislation as part of tax reform or otherwise that is actually coherent and that does actually address the fundamental problem of whatever it is we're trying to solve, rather than just putting a Band-Aid over it and going on to the next thing, which is, of course, what we always do. And let me give you an example of this, taking off where I was in the last question when I was talking about the interest allocation rules. Now, we all know those rules only apply for purposes of determining foreign and U.S. source income for then purposes of applying our foreign tax credit limitation. But there's no reason, in principle, they would have to be limited to that role, right? And in fact, when you look at the inbound side of interest, what you see is basically 163J and earnings stripping that takes an entirely different approach to the problem. Now, there are proposals out there now as part of tax reform that are essentially what we would all recognize as something like debt dumping rules. And what those rules do is they say, look, we're going to look at your worldwide interest expense. Money's fungible. We don't care where you borrowed, all right? And you can deduct in our country a proportionate part of that worldwide interest as long as it doesn't exceed, right, your average interest. And there are different ways to measure it. I think one of the recent proposals uses GAAP, which is probably a bad idea, but whatever, maybe it's fine. The point is that that rule is really an inbound rule. It's being proposed as an inbound rule, but there's no reason on earth why we couldn't also make it an outbound rule. Why don't we think about interest in one simple, coherent way and then write legislation to get that way, in which case inbound and outbound would probably be the same because they'd be the same policy. The other thing I want to mention, which is kind of disconnected from that, but the reason that I always get frustrated when people talk about inbound and outbound, although I do it myself because we just get used to speaking that way, is that at least since the 1990s, in my experience, most capital flow, well, not most, I'm not trying to put a number on this. Most of the work that I do, capital flows are multi-directional. What do I mean by that? I don't have clients who just are purely US companies who make an investment outside the US, or purely foreign companies that make an investment in the US. What you see is, private equity funds that raise capital from a broad range of sources worldwide and then invest that capital in a broad range of targets and portfolio companies worldwide. And half the time we're struggling with these things and coming up with these complicated structures that people think are, you know, maybe abusive or something, has nothing to do with abuse. It has to do with you got to make the rules work for both inbound and outbound, and you got to do that in actually two different ways because you've got US and foreign investors. And so it's actually really complicated to get it even close to right. And this is why I think we just need to rethink our system of US rules for international taxation from the ground up without thinking about them as outbound or inbound.
Okay. So polling question number 4. What about the taxation of inbound investment? Can the rules for outbound investment be reformed without addressing inbound investment? Possible answers are 1A, yes, there can be reform without addressing inbound investment. No need to change the rules as part of a reform for the rules for outbound investment. 2B, no, it's delusional to focus solely on outbound investment without also addressing the rules for inbound investment. The distinction between inbound and outbound is artificial. So, vote.
Because we
I
don't
think
really have a
everyone said
disagreement.
these sort of.
Yeah, we don't have a disagreement.
Everyone said these sort of.
Kim, this is amazing. 78% agree with you that it's delusional to focus solely on outbound investment
Well,
without
22%
also
disagreed with all
addressing
four
rules
of
for
us.
inbound, and only 22% are opposed to that proposition. I'm not sure where David is on it, who believe that there are different issues and no need to change the rules for one simply because you're changing the rules for the other. So can we go back to polling question number 1 now? If you'll recollect, the question we had
Just might be different now.
related to, on the first debate question, is corporate residence meaningful as a basis for jurisdiction to tax? Kim said no. Others were a little bit less certain. If not, and we keep the corporate income tax, what are the alternatives? Okay, so 1A is yes, it's meaningful as a basis for jurisdiction to tax, and 2B is no, corporate resident is no longer useful, and there are lots of alternatives, such as the source of income. I love the music. It's great. Yes, corporate residence is meaningful, and 53%. No, it's no longer useful, 47%. So Kim has swept the field, as often is the case.
I'm just happy with my 17 and 2/3%.
Dan, it sounds like you're used to being in the minority. Anyways, we're early, Larry, but thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Mark and David, Willard and Kim and Dan for your participation in the debate session. We're now going to have the afternoon break, which is across the hall. Please return your polling devices on the way out, and we'll resume at 3:10 with Alan Viard's presentation. Thank you very much.